All right, so we'll get started. So we have enough time for questions and answers at the end. Sticking with our theme of chaos, I thought, well, let's talk about the chaos presidency. When I told a friend what I was going to do, he says, "Well, you're gonna tick everyone off." These are kind of the two observations I'm working with. The Trump administration is chaotic, but not uniquely chaotic. So obviously, people who believe that there isn't chaos in the Trump administration won't be necessarily happy with the premise of this talk. Those who think that somehow that the Trump administration is uniquely chaotic won't be happy with this too. As historians do, we like to come along and say that, well, what we see as two of the most common words since 2016 in our political discourse, particularly if you watch CNN, is chaos and unprecedented. And I would say that one of those words is appropriate and one of those words is not. And so what I want to do is go through and look at different periods in American presidential history that have been characterized by chaos. So we kind of need to start working with a definition of chaos. Well, chaos is not this. This is what I would define as markers of a good presidency. If we take kind of the whole stretch of the American presidency, and it's changed a lot over the years, I would say that these are kind of the three markers for a successful president. And if you're struggling in one of these areas, probably this is rightly defined as varying degrees of chaos. The one thing you'll notice is not on there is likability. Likability actually is one of the primary characteristics by which people choose their presidents, especially since World War II. Unfortunately, it is the least valuable to consider. These are much more important in evaluating our presidents. And when we do, we would see that while the Trump administration has struggled in these three areas, other presidents have struggled in these areas too, as much, if not more, than the current president. This is probably too obvious. Name that president. Anyone want to guess who said that? I read this and I thought, George Washington might be the one president that you're wrong about. George Washington might be the one president that struggled with chaos more than the current Trump administration. And so we begin with George Washington. First thing we need to understand about the Washington presidency is he's really swimming against the political tide. The American Revolution and the build-up to the American Revolution had seen unprecedented popular involvement in politics. People who had not taken an interest in politics, who had been taught to defer to their social betters, the wealthy, the educated, what have you, became interested in politics. And after the Revolution, particularly those who had served in the Revolution, they didn't really want to leave it behind. This is where the idea of America being for the common man really originates in the years after the American Revolution. However, there was a minority of the population who wanted to kind of pretend like the revolution, parts of the revolution didn't happen. The revolution against England, the winning of freedom had happened, but this new era of popular politics had not happened. And George Washington happened to be part of and the leader in that minority. So Washington, when he took the presidency in 1788, put on his own MAGA hat, make aristocracy great again. And he sought about to try to stem the political tide, and we'll see ultimately that he failed. Now in some cases it's choices that he made. One of the markers I said of a good president is able to recruit and manage a good team. Now Washington recruited a great team. He had Alexander Hamilton as his Secretary of Treasury. He brought Thomas Jefferson back from Paris to be Secretary of State. The problem is in the management. Hamilton and Jefferson hated each other. They represented two different visions of America, not just between North and South, but between a society which venerated the common man as a political participant and the one that kind of looked down upon the common man as not capable of the kind of virtues needed to be involved in politics. And so Jefferson and Hamilton were always at each other in the administration. Washington still could have managed them well by allowing one to win at one time and one to win at the other. Washington allowed Hamilton to win again and again and again. Jefferson was so frustrated working in Washington's administration, he left in 1793. He went and joined his associate from Virginia, James Madison. Madison and Jefferson were building America's first opposition political party, known as the Republicans. Washington and Hamilton, by default, were becoming leaders of the Federalist Party during this time. Things that stand out from Washington's presidency: the way you manage crisis. In order to help not just pay off the war debt, but pay for Alexander Hamilton's tax program, a tax was placed upon whiskey in 1791. The farmers in western Pennsylvania revolted against. They had been fighting against taxes. They had been fighting against foreclosure for well over a decade, and now a government that had the power to tax is now imposing a tax upon them. And there was massive unrest and revolt in western Pennsylvania, culminating in 1794 when 7,000 western Pennsylvanians mobilized, thinking they were going to march on Pittsburgh and do something to the city. At best, shut down the courts. At worst, leave the place in waste. Washington ultimately raises an army, raises a militia, 15,000 strong, and he himself. I'd like to think that Washington himself probably could have rode out into western Pennsylvania by himself. Because who wants to be the person who says, yeah, I knocked George Washington off his horse. I killed George Washington. Nobody wants to beat, in terms of likability, Washington's really high on the list. But in this particular policy, the use of extraordinary military force against your own civilian population was a problem. But it was the only way that they felt that they could handle this particular situation. Finally, the other thing I'll point out in Washington's presidency is in 1795 the Jay Treaty. Again, Washington was swimming against the political tide, not only in trying to restore a sense of aristocracy to the country, but also in trying to, following Hamilton, redirect the country back to closer relationship with England. Of course, this is a hard sell for a country which had just fought a war for independence against England. A lot of the population thought we should be closer to France. France, of course, had actually aided us in our war against England. France was in the midst of its own French Revolution at this time, and Jefferson and a lot of the American population actually believed we should be on the side of the French Revolution, particularly in its radical democratic tendencies. Well, the Jay Treaty, named for John Jay, who worked this out with Britain, a secret treaty that, when it was released, showed that Washington and Hamilton administration were trying to tie us closer to England. And this, more than anything, turned the opposition Republican Party into a mass party, a party that in many ways outnumbered the Federalist Party at this time. As Washington is trying to work out this, kind of restore this relationship at Hamilton's advice, but again, it's, I think this would go under a failure of communication, the ability to communicate why it is that a country that we just fought a war for independence from is the country that we really need to have the closest economic and cultural ties to, or why being aligned with the French Revolution maybe is not the best thing. But this treaty was all done in secret. It was released, and the political chaos, the conflict, the disorder in the United States at this time was really unprecedented. When you think today is bad, it's nothing like the 1790s. Washington will leave. He leaves us with a farewell address. Washington is one of the great communicators in American presidential history. The farewell address will be read at the beginning of Congress for over 100 years, and we still go back to the farewell address as a marker of great wisdom. Nevertheless, Washington left the country, despite his address, left the country, practically speaking, a mess. Jefferson had left Washington's administration to run for president in 1796. He would be up against one of his best friends, and Washington's successor, John Adams. Adams was kind of in between the Federalists and the Republicans, but he tended to side more with the Federalists. Well, Adams wins the most votes. Jefferson wins the second most votes. What happens in the 1790s when you win the second most votes?
Vice President.
You become vice president. Until the 12th Amendment, which they very quickly realized, oh, this is not going to work in the future. Imagine a situation in which Donald Trump had won the presidency and Hillary Clinton had been elected vice president. That is what happened in 1796, where the leader of the Federalist Party, the leader of the Republican Party, find themselves occupying the same administration. And it's really tragic. It destroyed their friendship for several years. Eventually they rediscovered themselves, but it broke them. Kind of the final straw was Hamilton convinced Adams with the stemming from the Jay Treaty, the amount of unrest, upset at the Federalists, at the federal government, with supporting this connection to England and fighting against the French Revolution. Hamilton convinced Adams to pass a series of acts called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which for all intents and purposes attempted to limit political speech, which is problematic under the First Amendment. Jefferson, at this time, begins, we think of secession, nullification, what have you, as things that come later. Actually, the person who invented the idea that a state could nullify a federal law was Thomas Jefferson, and it was because of the Alien Sedition Acts. So here you have the Vice President of the United States, who on the side is also trying to figure out, does the Constitution allow a state to negate, to nullify a federal law? He's kind of writing that up. He never goes too far with it. By the way, what's the answer to that? Our Constitution scholars out there, does the state have any right to nullify federal law? No. But Jefferson's trying to figure out, Jefferson didn't write up the Constitution. He was in Paris at the time. So he's trying to figure out, maybe there's some wiggle room in which I can do this. And so the chaos in the country and the administration just grows during these years until the election of 1800, one of the most vicious elections in American history. I mean, you think political ads are nasty today. All right, this is God sending the American eagle to stop Thomas Jefferson from sacrificing the Constitution on the altar of Satan. Now, I don't want to say that candidates today haven't been called satanic, but maybe not quite as advert as openly as Jefferson was during these years. Ultimately, Jefferson wins, and the Federalist Party kind of breaks up. It kind of helps that Hamilton had an unfortunate duel with Aaron Burr. The Federalist Party quickly evaporates, and the Republican Party just becomes the de facto party until it splits into kind of rival factors as well too. But all this to say that the 1790s rivals, I think, any other period in our history in terms of chaos. And in terms of the ability to manage chaos, we can say that Washington often engaged in decisions that made the chaos worse, not better. And in the end, ultimately, his vision, the Hamiltonian vision, yeah, Hamilton gets his play on Broadway, but ultimately, this is a Jeffersonian country, whether you like it or not. Lincoln. Let's say a little bit about Lincoln. I'm going after the big ones here. So, Lincoln, when he took office, did something really unprecedented. His three greatest rivals in the Republican Party, he made them all members of his cabinet. And you think, with the thought that somehow he would be able to work with these people who had been his chief rivals, and honestly, in terms of their relationship with him, it did work pretty well. He allowed them to speak pretty freely, but they also deferred to him and generally allowed his decisions to go without too much questioning. But in terms of their relationship with each other, legendary in terms of the amount of infighting and just chaos and the ability of his cabinet to be able to work together. At a time when you would hope your cabinet would be able to be united because you got a thing to do, like win the war. And so it shouldn't surprise us that given the turmoil, the upset in Lincoln's cabinet, this is a political ad suggesting that Lincoln's cabinet was pretty corrupt, I know you can't see Lincoln there, but Lincoln's starting to tell a story. And that was kind of the impression that people had, that Lincoln, that a number of people had, that Lincoln really wasn't fit for office, that he just tended to, tell a story or tell a joke or something like that, and is a little too folksy, basically, to have this office.
Who's the guy with the long beard?
I am not sure which one that is. Yeah.
He looks pretty weird with his hair and
Well, all of them look a little bit out of sorts there. Yeah.
hair.
But see what they're up to. Lincoln, of course, struggled with his primary objective, which was using the vast resources at his disposal, the vast military forces, to actually win the war. Right? His problem, many of you know from your history classes, was leadership. And trying to find good leadership. It took him probably 2-3 years till he finally found somebody who could kind of work this out. But even Lincoln, who, no matter what your political persuasion, no matter who you are, almost every historian ranks Lincoln as our top president. Still, when you go back and you investigate his presidency, there was a lot of chaos there. There were a lot of things that at the time certainly didn't look like this guy is going to be rated our best president going forward. I think he deserves that reputation too. But the reality is that he did struggle, particularly early on, with finding a good leadership. So if you're looking for some extra reading or follow-up, or if you're wondering what to add to your Christmas list, I would recommend the book The Impossible Presidency. A historian friend who's arguing that really since World War II, given the responsibilities the United States takes on during that war, the presidency really became impossible to do well. That every president has struggled since World War II, particularly in era foreign policy, and that's where I'm going to kind of focus on with our evaluations going forward. But this would be a good book just to kind of reinforce that chaos is something that all presidents have dealt with, particularly as the United States takes on a kind of global ordering role during World War II. We have struggled all the more. And so no presidency has really been an unmitigated success since World War II. All have struggled. We're going to jump ahead to Reagan. We could look at other instances of chaos in earlier presidencies, but we're going to go to Reagan, in part because Reagan is so venerated, and we need to see that the Reagan presidency actually was filled with a great degree of chaos as well too. Not many people know this, but the Reagan administration was actually one of the most corrupt in American history. Over 138 officials in the Reagan administration would be indicted for crimes. That is the most of any presidential administration in American history. Reagan's administration was famous for its infighting, for turnover, for the movement of people around. It was just the cabinet, the administration was a fairly chaotic during this time, as inevitably cabinet officials kind of fight with each other. It's varying degrees. Lincoln was in some ways maybe able to manage that a little bit better than, say, Washington did. Reagan, it's kind of a mixed bag, honestly, in terms of policy. Reagan is often regarded as the great communicator, and I think rightfully so. In some ways, his vision, particularly coming out of the 1970s, a period in our history which really seemed to lack presidential leadership, lack presidential vision, that Reagan in some ways did communicate a new vision, and you hear our current president talk a lot about Reagan, peace through strength, and what have you. I guess when you look at the implementation of peace through strength, when you look at what Reagan actually did, it's a really mixed bag. And his policies, for as much as they in some ways ended the chaos of the Cold War, actually laid foundations for future chaos going forward. We could look, for instance, at his support for the fighters against the Afghanistan occupation during the 1980s. The Russians invaded Afghanistan. The Mujahideen, as they were called, were the primary kind of resistance groups. in Afghanistan. The United States ultimately ended up supporting the Mujahideen. Well, this worked out well. It was a kind of a military incursion that for the Soviet Union they could not afford. They particularly could not afford it when the Mujahideen are suddenly being armed with U.S. weapons. So ultimately, in terms of ending the Cold War, that was a successful policy. But in terms of laying the foundation for what's coming forward, there was not a lot of thought of, okay, now that we're training, we're arming the Mujahideen, what's going to happen to this part of the world once the Soviets leave and once we withdraw out of this? What's going to happen there? And of course, we know what happened there. The Mujahideen became the jihadists, who became the Taliban in Afghanistan and became Al-Qaeda. There's in both the Reagan and the Clinton administrations, I'll talk about it a little bit, there's a lack of awareness of how terrorism was something that was moving out of the state level and being internationalized or globalized during this period. And in some cases, U.S. policy under the Reagan administration is actually allowing that to take place. When we look at Central America, the efforts to fight against supposed Soviet operatives backed armies there in Central America. What actually ended up happening was the United States was fueling civil war in several Central American states. Interestingly, the same Central American states in which people are looking to leave and come to places like the United States. You've heard about you probably have heard the news about the caravan that is coming out of Central American states. They're generally coming out of states that had never fully recovered from the Civil War of the 1970s and 1980s in those regions. And the United States policy during that time was really to create conditions in which the Civil War could occur. There's a book called Inevitable Revolutions in which you could kind of track the Reagan administration's involvement in all of these, in perpetuating the Civil War in all of these regions. Again, there's the short-sightedness of attempting to win the Cold War. That did seem to make sense in some ways in terms of Afghanistan. It's hard to see how we were doing the same thing in Central America, but the longer term consequences of those decisions have made the world more chaotic, not less chaotic. And of course, tied to both the Middle East and to Central America is the issue of the Iran-Contra affair. So you want to talk about chaos in an administration. I don't know why we don't talk more about this one. This was really bad, really bad. You had a country in the United States who in 1983 is running around the world trying to convince the rest of the world, hey, stop selling arms to Iran. The United States has an embargo. We can't sell arms to Iran. Well, what do we find out in 1986 from news reports? That the United States had been selling arms to Iran. The very thing that 3 years before was saying nobody should do this, the Reagan administration was in fact doing it. Why were they doing it? Initially they got involved in this because Iran had about 6 hostages that we wanted back. And so a plan was developed where the United States would sell arms to Iran through Israel. Israel would receive the payment, receive the prisoners, and would come back to us. And so that ultimately did happen. The exchange of arms did take place. The hostages were freed. Initially, Reagan denied that. He did, to his credit, finally in 1987, he did come out and say, yes, we did do this, and yes, it was exchanging arms for hostages. He initially tried to say we didn't do that, but finally in 1987, he admitted his administration had in fact done that. But it's not called the Iran scandal, right? It's called the Iran-Contra scandal. It's the money that we earned from Iran during this time that part of his administration decided to funnel this money into Nicaragua to aid freedom, to aid fighters there in their civil war. Again, this violated congressional authority according to the Bolin Act. The United States couldn't do this anymore, and yet Reagan's administration did it. the disrespect for checks and balances and constitutional authority in this case. In both of these instances, where Congress just says you can't do this, and Reagan's administration, or people in Reagan's administration said, we're just going to do it anyways. Flagrantly do it. This is really bad. This is a really unprecedented scandal. Ultimately, I know that people remember peace through strength when they think of Reagan. The three words that I think of when I remember Reagan is, I don't remember. I don't remember. Now, he did admit to knowledge and essentially authorizing the exchange of arms with Iran. He never admits to involvement with the funding of the Contras. Instead, it's I don't remember or I don't recall. So either you have an administration that's so chaotic that with the president not knowing that his own staff is violating congressional authority, or Reagan did know, in which case you have an entire administration which was willing to violate congressional authority in this case. We'll never know the truth because once it became clear that Congress wanted the paperwork on what had gone down, Reagan's team actually burned all those documents. And so the paper trail is just lost. Thousands and thousands of pages of documents destroyed after they were requested from Congress. So even in the Reagan administration, even with all the successes of that administration, both the actual successes and I would say probably more importantly the psychological successes, because sometimes presidential successes are psychological in terms of their ability to inspire people. For as much of his successes, there was a lot in Reagan's administration that was chaotic. Clinton? All the people who were quick to criticize the utter turmoil at the first 6 months to year of Trump's administration in terms of getting positions staffed, in terms of figuring out who can work with who and all the infighting and people leaving and what have you, we're quick to forget that Clinton's administration began pretty much the same way. With massive amount of infighting and not staffing positions and turnover. It was just Clinton really struggled with getting a decent team in. He struggled with recruitment. Probably the same reason that Trump struggled with recruitment. These guys are not necessarily known quantities on the political scene, so it was hard for them to figure out who was best and who they could work with. And so they both struggled to get that team in place. Clinton eventually did. Trump is, he's kind of become his own team. He just hasn't replaced a lot of the positions. But we're kind of working. That's the Trump administration. I would say it's his ability to recruit and manage is still a work in progress. Clinton eventually did, but one thing that characterized his team is that they really didn't care about foreign policy. They cared about economics. They cared about globalization. They cared about things like NAFTA and opening up global trade and what have you. They really thought that economics could solve all problems. And so actual foreign policy problems was something that they didn't really concern themselves with or take much interest in. At a time in which the world's just at a new state. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union has dissolved. What does the United States do now? What is our role in the world now? What do we do? And Clinton had probably the worst people with the greatest indifference at a time when we probably needed more of that to figure that out. And so when you look at Clinton's foreign policy record, it's for the most part pretty abysmal. Whether we're talking about United States involvement in Somalia, or Haiti, a very mixed record in the Balkans. And then again, to go back to a point I was making about Reagan, the inability to understand the way in which terrorist networks were shifting, in which they were globalizing during the 1990s. Clinton's administration knew the name Osama bin Laden very early. We even had his cell phone number, I think as early as 1995. You could, I have it in my notes from my Middle East class, so anyone wants to try to call Osama bin Laden's cell phone number. I'm guessing he's probably been disconnected from not paying his bills. And he's conducting terrorist attacks during that time, but still the Clinton administration was unaware of the way in which terrorism was being globalized in groups like Al-Qaeda during these years. And it led to, just in terms of foreign policy, not much successes. Again, in Clinton, the likability factor is really high there, as it is with Reagan. But when you look at their actual policies, what you see, particularly foreign policies, you see a lot of chaos. Bush. I'll just say one word: Iraq. Bush is what happens when your foreign policy team is a little too united, gets along a little too well. They were so united, they had so much history together, they even had a name for themselves. They called themselves the Vulcans. And they came into the administration with a particular agenda regarding the Middle East, and central to that agenda was getting rid of Saddam Hussein. And it's unclear to me whether the aim was they really believed that they could democratize Iraq. That's unclear, just because you had people who were the people who were making those kinds of decisions or using that language in 2002, 2003 were the very same people who in 1992 and 1993 were the ones saying, you can't do this, you can't export democracy. And yet all the talk of 2002 and 2003 is exporting democracy. It's unclear to me whether they really believed that they could democratize Iraq or whether the goal, and there is some evidence that this was the goal, was simply just to destabilize Iraq. In fact, to destabilize two regions, Iraq and Syria, with the goal of ultimately, you're destabilizing Israel's chief rivals in that area. If you destabilize Iraq, you destabilize Syria, you isolate Iran, and Israel's security supposedly is bolstered. I'll let you be the judge of whether that's happened or not. But the one thing we can say is that Iraq became, and in some ways remains, chaotic, and of course that chaos has spread throughout the Middle East, including to places like Syria. Which brings us to Obama. Again, high on the likability factor, high on the popularity, high on the supposedly the great communicator. But again, when you look at his foreign policy record, right now, historians have Obama at 14 on lists of best presidents. He's actually ahead of Clinton and James Madison. I think he's going to drop. I think he probably should drop in years going forward, just because his foreign policy record, it's not just an issue of what he did, but again, and this will sound ironic given that the thing about Obama is he's supposedly kind of the great communicator, again, great speaker, great inspirer, and what have you. In many ways, his shortcoming was the inability to communicate a vision for U.S. foreign policy, particularly regarding the Middle East. I think, much like Trump, Obama was a disengager from the Middle East, but found himself in many ways forced to carry forward the Bush policy as much as he could. And it's under Obama that he's the president who has to deal with the fallout from the collapse of Iraq, the Arab Spring, and a movement for democratization within the Middle East coming from within the Middle East himself. With Obama, it's really you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. It's you support regime change in Egypt, you support regime change in Libya, even with supplying military support in that particular instance. And what do you get? You get in Egypt, it's settled down, but it's still not great. Libya, no one talks about Libya, probably because we don't want to know what's going on in Libya, because it's so awful. but the destabilizing of Egypt and Libya that stemmed from supporting regime change in that particular instance. Okay, so then when it comes to Syria's Arab Spring, we don't support, or we support regime change in terms of, well, Assad, there were several Obama's administration saying Assad needed to go. Nevertheless, there's no action upon that. And so what happens in Syria? It's not just the strategic loss of Russia being able to, Russia is probably going to come in. The link between Russia and Syria is very deep. It goes back decades, so that's probably going to happen anyways. Obama's refusal to engage in the Syrian situation made it all the easier for Russia to really have a foothold in that particular stake, and the body count necessarily increases with that. You're dealing with, it doesn't, in my estimation, surpass what happened in Rwanda under Clinton. But nevertheless, you're talking about a civil war in Syria which has left 500,000 people dead and millions of people displaced. And it's not over anytime soon. There's no still any kind of way forward yet there. I have to think that Obama's going to have to bear more of the responsibility for inaction, for that choice. But again, as best as we can tell, the inaction there stemmed from the choice to take action in Egypt and Libya, and to see the destabilization that happened there. That probably is what led him to not take action in Syria, or at least not direct action. You could say that his efforts against ISIS coming late in his presidency, the Trump administration was able to take over, was successful. But in terms of if the United States' role after the end of the Cold War was somehow to be involved in peacekeeping or some kind of humanitarian work or relief, it's just the U.S. record since the end of the Cold War in terms of humanitarian engagement is just, at best we can say, a mixed bag. We can also say that it is actually further chaos in some situations, and certainly in the Middle East that is the case. So again, equal opportunity offender, going after the bigs like Washington and Lincoln, but also going after your standard bearers if you're a conservative, Reagan, if you're a liberal, Barack Obama. I think the jury's still out in the Trump administration. If anyone would want to press me on why I think the Trump administration is chaotic, given the three markers of a good presidency, I'd be happy to do that now. But we do have about 22 minutes left. So I think at this time, I've given you enough evidence to suggest that chaos is something that has characterized several administrations, even administrations that we think of as somehow transcendent, somehow immune from history, that even those administrations have dealt with substantial degrees of chaos. Even the great ones have made some awful decisions. And again, kind of going with this idea of the impossible presidency, how does the United States play how does a U.S. president effectively lead the world? Well, it seems that every president since World War II has struggled in that. And so all that is to say, again, that the Trump administration, for all the language of unprecedented or this is somehow unique in our history, I want to suggest that that's not the case. Thank you. So I know I rushed through a lot of history, so if you have particular questions about anything I can explain further, or again, feel free to defend the current president.
So presidency, they're trying to make the world a better place, but you can't possibly bring pleasure to everybody. There's always going to be people that are disagreeing with. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. I think that's the point of the book that I referenced, and it's pretty much what history bears out, especially I would say since 1980. And particularly regarding U.S. policy towards the Middle East. It's hard to see a lot of a lot of progress being made in that particular region. It's hard to see kind of the end point as well too. So yeah, absolutely. It was hard not being president of just this one country, but when you take on the role of being a leader of the free world, the presidency, maybe not impossible. Again, presidents have had some substantial successes, right? Reagan worked well with Gorbachev in bringing about the end of the Cold War. I would say that the Iran deal of Obama was a very good deal, a great step forward, in that it actually got the Iranians to stop making weapons, unlike North Korea, which is just not testing weapons, but is still continuing to make nuclear weapons by all accounts that we have. So it's not that there haven't been some successes down the road, but it seems that continuing chaos has been a theme, particularly of U.S.-Middle Eastern relations. Yeah.
So I was going to ask, I think that you put a lot of focus into like the foreign policy of all the presidents, especially because I think we took a big stance about like the world order after World War II, right? I was going to ask, do you think, because I know that I'm reading books right now that are saying that the Cold War never even ended, that it's, that the Cold War as it was before might have ended, but our place in the world, like with China and the way that Russia is today, and it might even be more complicated than the World War, Cold War was 60s through 80s. I think, like, what do you think the chaos is going to look like in the years to come? And do you think, let's say like Donald Trump gets reelected, who knows? Could happen. Like, what is it going to look like for the United States in the world order?
The one thing about the Cold War, for as much as it fueled tensions in the so-called third world on both sides, right? I mean, that's where the idea of the Cold War doesn't really make sense when we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about Central and South America, because they actually fought hot wars with the United States on one side bankrolling it and the Soviets on the other side bankrolling it. But if we just take just kind of the world order in general, it is possible to see the Cold War era as a period of great stability. Now the whole Cuban Missile Crisis was a little bit rough, but even there, it wasn't like there were kind of multiple players working through that particular issue. It was one country having to work with one country, and so books have even been written. One with the title "The Cold War's Cooperation," where they've looked at dozens of times in which the Soviets and the United States actually worked together pretty well, and that there actually was stability because the conflict was centered largely upon just two kind of major countries. With the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union, that kind of conflict becomes a lot less binary, a lot more multifaceted, and thus a lot more complex, a lot more chaotic. And so, I mean, if you're suggesting is the United States going to move into a kind of new Cold War, or have we already moved into a new kind of Cold War with China? Is that an appropriate term for what's going on there? Possibly. And in terms of world order, it might not be a bad thing if the United States and China were involved in something like a Cold War, as long as that is able to provide stability to the rest of the world. But I don't see that happening. I see instead multiple centers of power, multiple centers of conflict in the 21st century. So I think things are actually going to get worse before they get better. And I think it's going to be harder for the United States to play the kind of role that it was able to during the Cold War years, because the world is so much messier, right? And you see that reflected with the presidents. Obama really was a disengagement president, and was ultimately forced to do things or not do things that didn't work out. Trump largely is a disengagement president, more outspokenly so, I think, than Obama too. But under him, we renew our commitment to be involved in Afghanistan for probably your lifetimes. it's hard to imagine a situation in which Afghanistan would be left on somehow better footing. So all that is to say that I don't think that kind of the Cold War of the 20th century I don't think a new Cold War will break out in terms of that kind of bipolarity. Instead, I think that we're going to deal with a lot messier world. So, sorry. But.
Can you name 2 or 3 presidents who have met the criteria that you put up before?
Perfectly? No. No, I don't think so. Like I said, I could go through just about every president and find kind of chaos there. So, and I would suggest even the ones that I went through and suggested still deserve their place, right? I still would say that Lincoln deserves his place as top president. For me, Lincoln deserves that billing because if any president could have just scrapped the Constitution and just say we're going to do whatever it takes to pacify the South, Lincoln would have been given a pass by history, right? Given the unprecedented crisis that he was facing, but he didn't do that. He still tried to conduct that war within the parameters of the Constitution, and it did create problems, right? He was reluctant to end slavery, for instance, issue an Emancipation Proclamation as a military necessity because of his respect for the Constitution. So I think that to me is why Lincoln, given the greatest crisis in American history, bends the Constitution but doesn't break it. I think that's why he deserves that kind of top billing. When I asked my son the question, who was a better president, George Washington or Donald Trump, he gave me one of these. And then I said, well, Washington. And I'm like, well, why do you think Washington? And he's like, well, because he was the first. And there's some truth to that, right? He was the first. So I think they deserve their top billing, and even with presidents like Reagan and Obama, in terms of their ability to communicate and inspire. If we think of the president's kind of mass psychological role, they were incredibly successful. I mean, I remember Reagan. I was kind of coming to political consciousness when he was president, and so it was a very encouraging time. On the other hand, I remember too at the end of his presidency saying $3 trillion in debt. We will never be able to pay that off. Like this is unprecedented. We will never be in any worse economic situation than this. Well, our national debt's a little bit higher than $3 trillion now. So I guess I was wrong there when I said unprecedented. So all that is to say. In terms of, do I think of presidents who are better than the ones that I've kind of named here? We could go to other presidents who are ranked very high, like FDR, and look at a number of his successes. But we also have to look at FDR and say, he doesn't bring us out of the New Deal. He does engage in some schemes that are very constitutionally suspect. The way that he conducted World War II in terms of any kind of humanitarian restraint is problematic as well. So I would say all presidents are kind of a mixed bag, and the jury's still out on Trump. I would have a hard time imagining that he would end up in the bottom of presidents, along with our worst president's Willard Fillmore. You ever hear Willard Fillmore? The reason for that. It was terrible. He was president between 1856 and 1860. Guess what he did to prevent the coming of the Civil War? Nothing. That's why he's, guess what, when he's still president when secession is occurring, guess what he did to stop secession? Nothing. So Fillmore is rightfully considered the worst. Literally a do-nothing president. Warren G. Harding, who's president after Woodrow Wilson, also is ranked. America enjoyed a time of pretty substantial economic prosperity at those years. Harding gets faulted largely because of his personal habits. I don't know why he ran for president, because he seemed to just not want to be president at all. He just spent as much time as he possibly could with his several mistresses, and one of the worst political scandals, the Teapot Dome scandal, was during his presidency. He was terrible. So, at least we'll be able to say this for Donald Trump in another 2 years or 6 years, that at least he did stuff. Okay, he did stuff. We're not exactly sure how it's all going to work out, but he did stuff. Unlike the presidents who are ranked worse, who just didn't take their job seriously. Other questions? Yeah.
You kind of referred to World War II as like this big change in our presidency. What were a few of the big points why did the presidency change so much?
I would argue that the United States took on a more active global role in a way that we didn't after World War I. We did so in World War II because the people who were in charge of the country at that time believed their own economic health depended upon it. There was an immediate need for the United States, having recovered from the Great Depression, having an economy that was running at truly record levels. How was that economy going to be kept running? Well, yes, we're going to sell to our own people, but we also need to sell to other countries. And who historically had the United States sold to? Western Europe. And where is Western Europe after World War II? They can't buy anything, right? And so the United States takes an active role in creating the United Nations, takes an active role in a conference that not many Americans know about, but the rest of the world does, because it was such an important conference, the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, where the United States created, the United States with other countries created the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, created a kind of worldwide framework for treaties and tariffs. The United States actively, through Bretton Woods, through the creation of the UN, is signaling that the United States is not going to be what we were after World War I, where we kind of be this kind of isolationist state. That we are going to play this active role in the world. We are going to help rebuild other countries. And we're doing it for our own economic self-interest, right? We need Western Europe recovered. We need a strong Germany. We need a strong England. We need a strong France so that we can have a strong American economy. They're interdependent. So that's why we're doing it. But the United States is taking on all of these kind of responsibilities. And ultimately, with taking on the economic responsibilities of Reconstruction, they will take on the military responsibilities of defending the world that we're reconstructing, defending that world against the supposed Soviet threat as well too. So the United States, between World War II and in the 1940s, largely commits itself to. We always rejected the global policeman role. But that's essentially what the role that we took on. And when you take that on, then you get the kinds of mixed bag presidencies that we've had since World War II. You get the kinds of some may say overreaches in places like the Middle East. Other questions? Yeah.
I got one last one.
That's right.
I was going to say, what do you think? Do you think that anybody actually cares about the Constitution when they get into the presidency? Because, I feel like when you get into a place of power, you're just like, I mean, that's cool and all, that's a great framework, but I think we're going to do whatever we want instead. And like I don't know, I thought that Congress was supposed to be the one that makes most of the laws and statutes. Like, when did the president become such an important policymaker? Like, when did that happen? I want to know, like, why is it that whenever anybody seems to get into a place of power, they don't seem all too concerned with holding up the rules that the country was really built on?
I'd say that some care more than others. When I look at the two presidencies who, since World War II, that I think have had the most respect, not just for constitutional but international law, I would say the George H.W. Bush administration and the Obama administration. But in both of those instances, following the rule of law didn't necessarily work out. So a large reason why H.W. Bush doesn't push through in the first Gulf War and take out Saddam is because the feeling that he really didn't have a mandate to do that. That the goal was to get Iraq out of Kuwait and leave it at that. And so his respect for the rule of law in that particular instance. Now, I'm not saying that H.W. Bush should have taken out Saddam Hussein at that point, right? But I'm saying that it didn't work out. Iraq became a place of humanitarian crisis because of the continuing sanctions. Iraq, a fairly secular state, became radicalized. Hussein himself, in some ways, became radicalized. It didn't work out. Same with the Obama administration. We can say in retrospect we should have stayed in Iraq. We shouldn't have withdrawn troops. So why did we withdraw? Because we were short-sighted? Because Obama's a disengagement president? No, because the Bush administration did not work out a status of forces agreement with Iraq. Iraq didn't want us to stay. And so Obama had to either respect the rule of law in that particular case, respect that his predecessor did not get a status of forces agreement to stay there, or he could have just, in this case, kind of flouted, international custom. He chose to abide by international custom, and how did that work out? Al-Qaeda became ISIS. So again, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I think a lot of presidents have tried to respect constitutional authority, and it hasn't worked out for them. Whereas others have flouted constitutional authority, and particularly the case with those involved with Iran-Contra, and it didn't work out for them either. So let me ask, did anyone expect this would be like the bashing Trump session? Is that why you came out? Are you very disappointed now that I wasn't going there?
No, I'm actually glad I didn't.
I think there's different ways that you could take a presentation like this. One would be that I'm actually trying to bolster sympathy for the president and suggesting that what we see as a chaotic presidency and a political discourse that's out there is he's the worst president ever. This guy doesn't represent American values. He's a complete outlier. Well, history would suggest that that's not the case. History would suggest that he and his administration are sheltering.
He's done some okay things, but he needed to change in the past.
Well, ask me in 2 to 6 years.
In the near
All right,
past.
I'll come back in 2 to 6 years,
In
and
the near past.
I'll finish the slide.
In the near
Okay.
past.